Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to this edition of the Valley View. And this week I'm joined by Jennifer Hillman Magnuson. And Jennifer's an author, and you've kind of led an interesting life, but it kind of started here in the Salem area?
Yes. I grew up in Oregon, moved to Salem when I was 12 years old with my family. My father was an Oregon State police officer, and went to high school here locally, Sprague High School. And then went to the University of Oregon and Portland State. So I've been an Oregonian for some time. I met my husband in college, and we moved away after graduation, and we're now back after a bit of a hiatus.
But you not only just moved different places within the United States, you had a family of 5 children.
Correct.
And moved to India.
Yes.
And you wrote a book about this experience called Peanut Butter and Nan?
Yes.
And so I've got to ask, with 5 kids moving to India, that at some level that's got to be kind of terrifying.
I think having 5 kids on some level
is terrifying enough.
Right. And yes, logistically moving anywhere with any amount of people, it can be a bit of a nightmare. A lot of people don't move for that very reason. They don't want to face the hassle. And I think it's a good thing that we didn't know what to expect, and that we didn't really truly understand how big of a project it is to move across the world, because if we did, we wouldn't have done it, I think. So we are at the time living in Nashville, Tennessee, and my husband's job had an opportunity for him to live and work in India for approximately a year, and we just looked at one another and said, let's do this. Let's pack up the kids and let's go. And we flew by the seat of our pants with it.
You know, there was a movie that I particularly enjoyed called Outsourced,
yes,
where I think he was from Seattle area.
He was from Seattle,
yeah. And he ended up going to India to train people how to be call screeners. I believe that was their, and it was quite a change for him. So was it along those lines, except even worse, because now you've got kids going to school?
That movie was extremely accurate, and I stumbled across that movie on Netflix right before we moved to India. And I remember watching it and thinking, oh, I wonder if this is what the cultural assimilation will be like. Will we have the same difficulties? Will we get sick? And I watched it again a couple of years ago, and of course I had the hindsight of having lived in India, and that movie is extremely accurate. It was very similar to our experience. In fact, my husband ran call centers on the other side of the country. He was in Mumbai, and we were in the southeast part of India in Chennai, which used to be called Madras. And subtract the fact that he didn't have children, that was a really accurate depiction of what it's like to go stone cold into a country and a culture that you really don't have any knowledge of.
So how did you cope with this? I mean, you just had to be prepared for anything then?
Yes, you had to be prepared for anything, and the more we opened our mind to the experience and let go of any expectations, the easier it went. I think it's very natural to view anything through the lens that you view it through. I have an American lens, and so I go places. If I'm in Europe or when I lived in the Middle East with my family, I tend to look at things through a Western lens. And India is a place that you really have to sort of submit to the cultural flow of what you're submersed in. And then it gets a lot easier, but it's definitely so different from the pace. It's different in almost every way. The weather, it's extremely hot.
And humid.
There are over 1 billion people in a country that's about a third of the size physically of the United States, so it's very condensed, very populated, very loud at times. And once we started to let go of the fact that there weren't convenience stores and drive-through, Burger Kings, and there are fast food places in India, but the pace, the way of living day to day is so different. And once we started to accept that that was our new normal, that was when we started to become more comfortable with the experience.
Now, what ages were your children at this point?
Okay, so at the time, our youngest was 15 months, and then we had a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, all who turned 8 when we were there, and a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old. I think I've got that right.
So did the 12 and the 14-year-olds have, I would imagine they have, they're going through a lot themselves, and they have been growing up in a Western culture, and I would imagine that was probably more difficult for them than the younger ones, but maybe I'm mistaken on that.
That was my hypothesis going in, and I was very mindful of how I was going to try and shape the experience for my high schooler and for my middle schooler. And interestingly, it was easier on my older children and a little harder on my middle child, who was in elementary school. My oldest daughter attended the American International School in Chennai and absolutely fell in love with the entire experience. She loved the diversity of the school. She loved the fact that it was so different from living in Nashville, Tennessee, where she felt a lot of pressure to conform to a certain look. And typical teenage girls are concerned about their appearance and having makeup and everything just so. And a lot of these kids were expats from all over the world. And she fell in with a group of kids who just weren't as concerned about the outside as opposed to getting faster with their times on swim team or learning a new language, since her friends were from many different countries. And my youngest daughter really fell in love with the fact that we lived in a textile capital, and she was always sketching drawings and buying fabric and finding a tailor who would speak enough English where she could communicate with him and have her drawings converted into cute skirts or dresses. So they really soaked up the experience in a way I didn't anticipate.
Well, that is interesting, especially about the fabric, and because India's kind of known for its textile industry and like that. So she must have really enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, it was fun.
And for her to be designing her own skirts and choosing material.
And a lot to choose from in India, especially Chennai, which again, I believe it is the textile capital of India. So we had a lot of fun exploring the markets, and almost impossible to choose. You could only take as much fabric as your rickshaw driver could carry, so yeah.
Well, I won't get into that story, but because I'm basically the pack mule when my wife goes to Los Angeles to buy fabric.
Right.
So I kind of understand the theory there.
Yes.
But so your older kids, and I guess one of the things is that you would think that India being a British colony all those years, that speaking English wouldn't be a problem, but evidently it was something of a problem because there's many different languages in India.
So many different languages, so many different dialects. Certainly it's not a problem in the business sector, certainly wasn't a problem in the retail sector for the most part. But as we ventured into places that weren't highly populated with foreigners or that weren't tourist attractions, there were often times where we were the only people who spoke English. We tended to avoid those areas unless we had our friends who were natives, native to the area, take us. And we were very fortunate to have our very best friend in India, who was our landlord, and who basically decided that we were dumb Americans who weren't doing anything right, and she was going to help get us on the path of truly understanding India, and we were very grateful for that because
she adopted you.
She did. She took us under her wing and showed us parts of India that we wouldn't have been drawn to if we were just there experiencing life.
Well, that is very fortunate. And
yeah, we really lucked out.
I remember I went to Ireland and I ended up staying mostly in Killarney, mostly because I liked the bed and breakfast place that I was staying at, and the woman who ran it had actually lived in Boston for a long time, and she was, you know, she was always giving me tips about what I could do, and she would help me out. Like I wanted to go on this tour, and she got the driver to come to the door so I didn't have to go looking for it and like that.
Right. A middleman is a great thing to have sometimes in a foreign place. Yes.
But in the schools, generally they would be speaking English, so your children didn't have to learn another language, at least for the school part of it.
Correct. We were fortunate in that we chose an American accredited school. And interestingly, because even though it was an American accredited school, there were very few Americans at this school. A lot of local kids from around the city were there. We had a large population of Korean nationals who attended the school, and that was because I believe it's Hyundai, the car maker, had a manufacturing plant in Chennai. So my daughters were exposed to many different languages outside the classroom setting, but English inside the classroom.
Well, you said there were a lot of expats from like Europe, so there'd be like French, German, Spanish, Italian things.
Yes. My oldest daughter's best friend was there from Oslo, Norway, and that's actually now one of the languages my daughter speaks, because that was her first encounter with a friend who spoke a little bit of English, enough to get by and take a math class. And as her best friend was learning English, my daughter was picking up Norwegian. So.
Well, and that's about the right age too, because like once you get much older than that, it becomes more difficult to pick up languages. At least that's what the studies have shown.
Yeah, it's that ship has sailed for us. But interestingly, our youngest, who was just learning to speak, he learned to walk in India. He's the fifth child and a boy, so we didn't have expectations that he would be extremely verbal very early. And he wasn't at the time. He had a very basic vocabulary, and he did a lot of babbling. And one morning, our nanny said to us, he's speaking Hindi. He's speaking Hindi to Lakshman, who was our cook. And I thought, oh no, he's not speaking Hindi. He says mama, dada, and look. You know, that's his vocabulary. And he was. He would push open, he would crawl over to the kitchen door and push it open, and he would shout out Bhaiya, which is Hindi for brother. And he called Lakshman brother, and then he would go on to tell him if he was hungry or if he wanted to be picked up and walked around outside. So he spoke more Hindi in the beginning than he did English, and none of it stuck, but...
Oh, well, that is kind of unfortunate.
Right, yeah. We didn't stay long enough, I think, for it to stick.
Well, what were some of your more surprising things that you learned about India? The things that you weren't kind of expecting? Maybe other than the color run, because you'd been exposed to that.
Right, exactly. Let's see, I think there were so many unexpected elements because I had an extraordinarily limited knowledge base of what to expect. In fact, I joked to family that when I was trying to explain what India was like to my children prior to us arriving, I was pulling information from Rikki Tikki Tavi, which is a book I read as a child, the Jungle Book. It was really egregiously tiny amounts of information. So I feel like I was in a constant state of surprise. But overall, I think the biggest takeaway for us, that was the biggest surprise, was how much fun we had as a family with so little. We went over there with very few belongings. We didn't have a lot of room in our home. We were in a very small home. We did a lot of work with a local orphanage, and these kids had nothing. And we had, I would say, the best year of our life collectively as a family without the trappings that we had become accustomed to back in the States, and things we thought were necessities, the big SUV, the packed schedule, you know, everyone gets their own bedroom and has a closet filled to brimming with clothes. We didn't have those things, and it ceased to matter because we focused so much more on being in the moment and experiencing something so different.
Well, that is interesting because I know that quite often we moved around when I was a kid, and so like a lot of times you didn't really hold on to possessions very long. And I remember my one of my brothers was very upset because his stuffed cat got left behind in Wichita. But so you kind of learn to let go of things and not collect a lot of things. And it does help you, I think, because then it makes things easier because you're not dragging around all these things,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and it makes you focus more on people rather than things.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think we can all get there without moving to India,
Yeah.
but we make it so easy to live that way in the States that it can sometimes get pushed to the side in terms of a family goal.
And I think also, too, what leads to that is sometimes there's kind of pleasure in having something new.
Right.
And so you start accumulating new things because once the newness is worn off,
Exactly.
you need something else. But when you don't have the ability to stack up a whole lot of things, it makes it so you appreciate the things that you do have and the things that you can do. Because I remember my mom, she used to basically kick us out of the house just because she didn't want us running all around foot. And, you know, and I'd go out in the fields and the woods and like that and just be gone all day until it was, you know, maybe I'd come home at lunch. Sometimes I wouldn't.
Right. Right.
And I just found that interesting because I learned a lot about the woods, and sometimes kids would then come to me to learn about where the good fishing places were, where the good places to hike were, and that was much more enjoyable than sitting around, you know, in the house playing games or you know, whatever.
Or having a play date, you know, puppet mastered by your mom.
We didn't have
play
that.
dates back
No,
then.
we didn't have those.
Neither did
You had to fend on your own. You know, if you wanted to find friends, you found them yourself. You know, sometimes from going to school, you know, from taking the bus, and because a lot of times it seems like we were picking up moving all the time. So you know, that was another thing. You didn't really establish sometimes real good friendships until we kind of settled permanently.
Right.
But you know, it's sometimes difficult, you know, to pick up and move and you know, miss your friends. But after the first few moves, you kind of get over that.
Right. Right.
So, but you're also an author, and now I take it Peanut Butter and Nan is something that is basically about your adventures in India.
Yes, it's a travel memoir about India specifically. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you've written other articles, and so what are your major interests when you're writing?
I'm a creative nonfiction writer, so I don't think I've published a single bit of fiction. I have been a freelance author for about 10 years, and I've written for Nickelodeon, I've written for print magazines and online magazines, and I tend to write about my family, and they love that to varying degrees. But they provide such great
Endless
material.
material,
Yeah,
yes.
they really do. I've written about motherhood in general terms, and with a couple of different articles here and there, you know, for feminist publications. But primarily I write about the experience of motherhood. And now, of course, I have a lot of material since we've lived in 2 different countries outside of the United States, and that's always...
And so you can observe how other mothers do things in other cultures and other places.
Yeah, you can. And also, I think sometimes we think that when we change our location, that maybe somehow will change, and our parenting or our mothering will be different. And maybe with certain logistical things it is, but I think it's like the saying, wherever you go, there you are. So,
yes.
Right.
But you can see how other people do things, and sometimes you can kind of incorporate some of those things into how you handle things. And I would imagine India, because like you were explaining, it's a slower pace. It's more relaxed, and maybe you don't need to be stressing about getting little Johnny over to the Little League practice and Mary over to ballet and all like that. Just enjoying your life and whatever the kids want to do at the time, because I find that too much structure isn't good for the kids either.
Right. I agree with you.
So you write on motherhood. What are some of the lessons maybe that you've learned about motherhood that you think need to be shared, that people maybe aren't doing enough of?
Oh, well, I don't think that there is enough sharing when it comes to parenting, the post and adolescent experience. I think we tend to share, it's so easy to share things that are easy or happy or joyous, and it's like looking at someone's Facebook page. They don't post pictures of a family squabble over the dinner table. They don't post pictures of their living room when it's messy. You tend to see the shinier sides of who we want to
The prettified
show.
version of it.
And there's an element of that, I think, to writing about parenting younger children. And then there's certainly, not to discount the fact that it can be very frustrating and filled with struggles, because it can be, and it is. But I think that the collective conversation really shrinks as our children get older. And we don't have play dates for teenagers, and we don't have mommy groups
Right.
where we can bring our 17-year-old. And it's easier, I think, to brush some really serious topics that parents of teenagers want to talk about under the rug and just write it off with something very vague, like, oh, they're a handful. And that's why I really enjoy the work I do with a literary magazine called Brainchild. It's a literary magazine called Brainchild, the magazine for thinking mothers. And I like that this particular journal welcomes authentic and real dialogue for parents of children of all ages. And I think we need more of that. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's hard to get real dialogue out of teenagers
Mm-hmm.
and even young adults.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think of my own children and how they've developed.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's real easy to talk to them, and other times it's not so easy.
Right.
But sometimes they need you. You know,
Yes.
even as they get older, sometimes they still do need you, because sometimes they're going through experiences for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mhm.
you know, as someone who's been around a while, you've had a few of those experiences and can maybe help them out through those things.
And I think just being there,
Yeah.
right. They don't necessarily want us to tell them what to do, but they want to know that they have someone who's there, maybe as a comfortable chair where they can.
Or if they need to take a time out. Maybe their
Mhm.
life isn't going well and they just need to kind of reassess. You know, I make sure that my kids know that you can come home.
Right.
And, you know,
Yeah.
if you need to take a time out, I don't care.
Right.
You know, we're glad to have you.
Exactly.
And I think that's worked out well,
Mhm.
you know, because I think a lot of times young adults think they have to do everything on their own.
Right.
But sometimes when you've headed down the wrong path or the wrong career path, say,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
time to kind of look at what do I really want to do?
Mhm.
And sometimes that requires some backing up and just kind of reevaluating where you are.
Well, and kids think, I think that it's okay to know that you might not always know the answers to those questions. And you don't have to have those questions answered at a certain age.
No.
I think our kids feel a lot of pressure to have their ducks lined up very early.
Well, you know, and that's something that I always found kind of strange, you know, even in college, where they're asking you to pick a major.
Right, yeah.
And like, I know with my son, it was like every year in high school, he was on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't even have a clue as to what he wanted to major in when he went off to college.
Right.
And so, you know, things change with kids. And I think they should be kind of open to various experiences.
Yes, I agree.
And, you know, I did an interview with another author, and he had kind of a varied life where he was doing very different things.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me of a movie I'd seen where one of the main protagonists, he changed his occupation every 3 years because he really wanted to explore life.
Right.
And he didn't want to be typecast as one particular kind of person. And I think a lot of times, because if you get off the so-called career track, it's hard sometimes to find your way back. And, you know, doing new things is kind of scary. But, you know, people have a lot of capacity to do various things. And you got to give yourself permission to try them out and fail. Because that happens.
Right. I agree. I think that that's something we want our children to take with them as they think back to living in different cultures and seeing so many different things, knowing that there is so much out there and that you don't have to just taste one thing. You can taste so much. So I think it'd be great if we could all have a new career every 3 years if we so chose.
Well, yeah, and I think that, you know, I had it kind of forced upon me where, you know, I got laid off, and so now I got to try different things out. But it made me realize that I could do other things. I didn't have to just do this one particular thing. It paid well, but I mean, there were other things out there.
Right.
And actually, one of the most rewarding jobs I had was when I moved up here to Oregon, mostly because I couldn't find steady employment in California. I got a job subbing at schools, and I ended up at a school where I was a teacher's aide with special needs kids, and they really needed men in the classroom because they had half of them were boys, and they had, it's funny because a lot of times boys do not listen to women's voices, and that was one thing I kind of picked up on from going out on field trips with my kids. So it worked out really well, and it was probably the most rewarding job I've ever had, because even making a small, what I think of just a small improvement is something big to some of those kids.
Right.
And it's something that you have to be willing to try out and do things.
I agree.
And some of those kids were what they call oppositional defiant, so you really had to think about what you were telling them before you said it.
I imagine that's a tough crowd.
And that kind of works with teenagers too.
Yeah. A little reverse psychology doesn't hurt.
So what are some of your other experiences though in writing? So you've written about motherhood, but you write nonfiction. So you have to kind of immerse yourself in a subject, or you just draw from your own experiences?
Boy, it just really depends. Currently, I'm co-editing an anthology. So I have the great privilege of working with a stable of other authors and artists and some actors who are all contributing to this wonderful project. And it's my first time as an editor, and I'm very thankful to have a brilliant co-editor, which they say the best way to be a good leader is to hire people who are smarter than you are.
Or at least have a different skill set.
Yes, I think we checked both those boxes with my co-editor. So that is fun, and it's nonfiction. They're personal essays about embarrassment and shame and morbid humiliation, more on the lighter note.
Or Tales from the Dark Side.
Right. Exactly.
So and one of the things too is like about editors is that I've noticed that proofreading seems to be a disappearing skill or disappearing from books, because I'm quite often seeing new books come out with errors in them, which I find really kind of upsetting. So is that something, can you explain why that's happening?
I don't think I can offer you the definitive explanation, but I can tell you it's definitely a thing. And I was recently having a conversation with a friend of mine who is a newspaper journalist and also a writer, and he said that pretty much industry-wide they have gotten rid of not editors, but copy editors on staff, and some of it's budget-related, time constraints. And it's a dying thing. And in fact, I just had a conversation with a contributor to the anthology I'm working on. My co-editor was looking through her manuscript and noticed that she was double spacing after a period, which even I did not know until a couple of years ago. And it's embarrassing. My Chicago Manual of Style is sitting on my desk collecting dust, and I really should have known this, but it's apparently one of the quickest ways to tell a writer over the age of 40 is if they double space after a period.
Well, like me.
Yeah, and it's a hard habit to break.
It is.
Yeah.
And I'll just have to leave it go.
I know.
Jennifer Hillman Magnuson, I really want to thank you for coming in today and sharing your experience about
pleasure.
India and about writing and motherhood.
Yes, my pleasure. It's great. Great to be here.
And this has been The Valley View with your host, Ken Adams, and come back next week.